The 16th and 17th centuries in history were for Spain a time of rapid expansion and conquest in which her power and reach in the world grew significantly. Though many of the Spanish conquests during this time period were successful, like the Spanish conquest of Mexico for example, there were some expansionist projects that never materialized. One of the more humble and insignificant of these projects was the conquest of China. Yeah, China. This is the type of ambition only EU4 players are even capable of possessing. Referred to as La Empresa de China, or in English, the Chinese enterprise, it was one of those projects that never did materialize. However, there does exist a small island just off the coast of mainland China, considered by some to be a part of China, which for a brief period of time the Spanish occupied a small portion of. That island is none other than the island of Taiwan, at the time known as Formosa, or to the Spanish as Hermosa. Now, some quick etymology. During the age of exploration, the first Europeans to reach the island we now know today as Taiwan were the Portuguese, who named the island Ilha Formosa, which in Portuguese means beautiful island. Now, in Spanish, the word for beautiful is hermosa, so the Spanish called the island, well, hermosa. Up until the 20th century, the term Formosa was generally the word used by Westerners when referring to the island. Due to the historical time that this video covers, I'll be referring to the island of Taiwan as either Formosa or Hermosa. With that being said, let us return to the main topic of the video. Spanish military ventures into Formosa began in 1626, however, calls for a Spanish occupation of the island started as early as 1586. When on July 26 of that same year, a letter by the Governor-General of the Philippines, Santiago de Vera, and the Council of Manila consisting of 50 members was sent to the King of Spain at the time, King Philip II. They requested that in the interest of Spanish security in the region, it was vital that military forces be sent to the area surrounding Manila. This of course included Formosa. Although the king agreed with the premise, nothing related to an occupation of the island was carried out. Then, 10 years later, in 1596, Spanish officials in the Philippines began suspecting of a Japanese invasion of Formosa, which worried them because they feared the Japanese would disrupt trade between Manila and China. To prevent this from happening, the officials argued that it was important that the Spanish act and take over Formosa before the Japanese could. All of this inaction from the part of the Spanish would change in 1624 as a result of the coming of the Dutch. After being expelled from the Penghu Islands by the Ming Dynasty, the Dutch looked to Formosa, and in 1624 they set up a fort off the coast of present-day Anping district. The Spanish viewed the Dutch presence in the island as a direct threat to Spanish interests in the region, so after 40 years of procrastinating worse than me when it's time to make a new YouTube video, they finally decided to act. On the 8th of February, 1626, the Governor-General of the Philippines, Fernando de Silva, launched a military campaign against Formosa. The expeditionary force set sail from Cagayan and was made up of 3 infantry companies and 5 Dominican friars. Among the friars was a certain Bartolome Martinez, who in 1618 had been sent on a diplomatic mission to China. During his trip, he had to seek refuge in Formosa, and since then he believed it was crucial that the Spanish take control of the island. On May 5, the Spanish made a landing in Cape Santiago, but decided to search for a more ideal place to build a fort. This search eventually took them to the Bay of Geelong, which is where modern-day Keelung is situated. Here, the Spanish established a fort which they gave the name Santissima Trinidad. At the time, the area was inhabited by 2 groups of Austronesian people native to the island known as the Tapari and the Kimauri, who fled after hearing the sounds of guns and canyons. Not long after, though, the friars encouraged the natives to come back and made efforts to Christianize them. In the early days of the colony, malnutrition became a big problem for the Spaniards. The Spanish had sent a ship carrying fresh supplies to the colonists, but it was unable to reach the colony because a typhoon disoriented the ship's course. To further aggravate the food problem, the colonists were unable to turn to trading with the natives because the Tapari and the Kimauri would not trade rice with them. The most desperate of the colonists resorted to eating the most typical and traditional meals Chinese cuisine has to offer, that is, dogs and rats. The food situation in Spanish Formosa, however, would be alleviated through trade with China, and after a while, some Tapari and Kimauris would become willing to trade food with them. Though James Wheeler Davidson, in his book The Island of Formosa, Past and Present, writes that for 12 years the new colony enjoyed perfect tranquility, it would perhaps have been more accurate to have written almost perfect tranquility. Rarely are new territories solidified without violence, and Spanish Formosa was no different. Nearing the end of 1627, a native chief from around the present-day Tamusui district requested for Spanish aid in a conflict with another rival chief. The Spanish accepted to help and sent 20 men. However, what the Spanish didn't know was that the native chief they were helping and the native groups he was at war with had privately made peace, and the former was about to do what I'm going to do to my closest friends when I become rich and successful. Switch up on those Neanderthals.
Whoa, that was risky.
The treasonous chief fooled the Spanish into leaving the village under the guise of taking them on a hunting trip. Once in the wilderness, the chief ambushed the Spanish, and what resulted was a bloody battle in which 8 of the Spanish died and the rest managed to escape. In retaliation for this violent betrayal, the Spanish sent a galley along the Tamsui River that raided native rice reserves. They found these rice reserves abandoned though because the natives tended to flee upon the approach of the galley. By the 1630s, trade had begun to increase and the situation in the colony had also generally become better. On the diplomatic side of things, relations with the giant next door, China, had improved. One reason for the improved relations could be pinpointed at a particular incident that occurred sometime before 1628 in the early days of the colony. In this incident, a Chinese official who had been visiting the colony was preparing to leave when suddenly natives came in and did the same thing the peaceful Black Lives Matter protesters did in 2020. Loot. When this happened, the acting governor of Spanish Formosa, Antonio Carreño de Valdez, took hostage some native leaders and pressured the natives into returning the possessions of the official. China wasn't the only East Asian country that was trading with the colony. Trade between Spanish Formosa and Japan started to rapidly increase, so much so that they began to see northern Taiwan as the point of major trade between Japan and Spain. However, since the shogun of Japan during this time wanted to be a little like me, mysterious and nonchalant, he enacted strong isolation policies that would result in the end of Japanese-Spanish relations. As I previously mentioned, 5 Dominican friars were attached to the first expeditionary force. This is because since the very beginning of Spanish Formosa, religion played a very noticeable role in the Spanish effort of colonization. Following the landing of the Spanish, in order to solidify and legitimize Spanish control over the island, a possession ceremony was performed. Part of the ceremony included mass and the erection of a cross. To some, converting Formosa to Catholicism was but the first step to the conversion of the Chinese and Japanese peoples, and the majority of the missionaries to Formosa intended to eventually advance to either China or Japan. One of the missionaries was Father Jacinto Esquivel, who arrived in Spanish Formosa in 1630. His original aim was to go to Japan, however, due to circumstances, he ended up in Formosa instead. Father Esquivel only expected to stay for a few months. Perhaps, though, the Lord had different plans for him because while he planned to only stay a few months, it ended up turning into 3 years. During his time on the island, he traveled to various villages in efforts to convert the locals, founded churches on the island, and learned the language of the local natives in order to write religious works that they could use. His time on the island came to an end in 1633. Similar to the otakus of our modern world, he always wanted to go to Japan, and he finally made the effort, but while on the ship, he and another priest were tragically murdered by the ship's crew. Father Esquivel wasn't the only martyr. Father Francisco Valles, also of the Dominican order, was murdered at the hands of the Cenarians. Pantaos was at war with the Senar people, and the Pantaonese invited Valles to their village, probably hoping to gain Spanish protection or support through him. You see, it had become a common trend for native villages to invite Spanish missionaries with the goal of achieving that same purpose. Father Valles sought to take a delegation of Cenarian headmen with him to Pantaos in the hopes of having the Pantaonese and Cenarians make peace with each other. The Cenarians, however, viewed this as Valles helping the Pantaonese, so after he woke up from his bed and exited the room, the Cenarians fired arrows at him. His words to his murderers were, "Pila, I come to you to teach the law of God, and you kill me." These examples aren't meant to prove that all missionary efforts failed. During the time of the Spanish war in Formosa, they did manage to convert roughly 5,000 natives. On the 26th of August, 1641, the governor of Dutch Formosa, Paulus Radenius, wrote a letter to the governor of Spanish Formosa where he informed them of his intention to take control of the Spanish side of the island. He warned that if the fort of Santísima Trinidad and the other Spanish outposts in the islands were not handed to the Dutch peacefully, that he would resort to military action. Portillo would not surrender Spanish Formosa. As a result of this response, the Dutch mounted an expedition against the Spanish at Fort Salvador. They landed their men near the fortress, and though they heavily outnumbered the Spaniards, they quickly retreated because the Spanish were too well fortified, and Traldenius concluded that he lacked sufficient cannons for a siege. Spanish Formosa, however, would not last very long after this. Spain had ventured into Formosa with 2 primary objectives in mind. 1. To support the Manila-China trade, and 2. To counter the Dutch. The colony had effectively failed to deliver in both points. With regards to the first one, to support the Manila-China trade, it was expected that the colony would serve as a transshipment point. However, it soon became clear that it was more cost-effective for Chinese merchants to sail directly to Manila. Furthermore, if a transshipment point was necessary, Macau provided an equally, perhaps even better option as opposed to Formosa. But what about the second point? Some supporters of the colonization of Formosa argued that the colony would help in countering a blockade by the Dutch, but in this regard too it had failed. Thus, when the Captain General of the Philippines, Sebastián Hurtado de Corcuera, who also happened to be a strong supporter of withdrawing from Taiwan, was involved in a military campaign in Mindanao, he had no problem in recalling 3 companies from Formosa. This was the vast majority of Spanish troops in Formosa, and it left the island with only 1 Spanish company. Having heard news of this from Chinese traders, the Dutch immediately decided to seize the opportunity, and in August 1642 they approached the Spanish fort of Santísima Trinidad with 4 large ships, some smaller ones, and roughly 369 soldiers. Though the landing force faced strong Spanish and Aboriginal resistance, the Dutch were able to push through and force the Spanish and their Aboriginal allies to retreat. Finally, after 6 days of fighting, the Spanish were overwhelmed and surrendered the fort to the Dutch, bringing the end of Spanish Formosa. Corcuera would end up receiving most of the blame for the Spanish loss of Formosa, so much so in fact that the succeeding Captain General would end up having him jailed. It's interesting to think about what could have been had the Spanish been able to retain control of Formosa. Perhaps they would have gone out to carry out La Empresa China. What is La Empresa China? Well, perhaps someday I'll make a video on it.